These 10 JRPGs were so ahead of their time. Which ones? Stick around and find out. Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon, and pre-intro me is right. Today, we're looking at 10 JRPGs that were so far ahead of their time, which helps them hold up surprisingly well today. Sometimes it's gameplay that hits on a perfect loop that has never been fully replicated, or a method of storytelling that has never again been attempted, or maybe all of the above. These are my top 10 picks, but let me know yours down in the comments along with why you think they deserve to be on this list. Okay, enough yapping. Let's get on to more of me yapping. Persona 3 for the PlayStation 2 flew under my radar at first. Maybe it's just because I felt a little burned by Persona 1 and 2 for the original PlayStation. I know those games have their fans, but I just couldn't connect with them. They were too hard and I wasn't falling in love with the characters, so I assumed Persona 3 would be more of the same. But Persona 3 was taking a shot in the dark by drastically redoing everything about the Persona and Shin Megami Tensei formula that had been established up until then. So Persona 3 is the introduction of what we think of today as modern Persona. When people talk about the Persona series today, they really only mean Personas 3 through 5 because of how dramatically Persona 3 changed it up. It did this by more or less creating an entire subgenre of JRPGs, the life sim dungeon crawler. What this means in practice, in case you're not familiar, is this. In Persona 3, you control a nameless and voiceless protagonist who transfers to a new high school. Right away, you're sucked into some crazy shenanigans involving a mysterious 25th hour of the day that normal people can't experience, and you and your dorm mates end up having to fight shadows, basically some messed up representation of, I don't know, some Jungian philosophical stuff. It's too early for me to try and parse all that right now. But they're bad monsters, so you fight them. Good stuff. Anyway, all that shadow fighting only happens at night. During the day, your character has to go to school, and then after school, they have to figure out what they're gonna do. You can get a job, join a club, hang out with friends. Every option passes the time and gives you some sort of gameplay-related boost, and figuring out how to maximize your efficiency can be a lot of fun. Yeah, I know that doesn't sound fun, it sounds like work, but it's a game. They use lots of cool sound effects and stuff that makes your brain happy. Now, this probably sounds like a lot of games you may have played, and the thing to keep in mind is, this game came out in 2006. It established a trend that wouldn't get picked up on in a significant way for quite a long time. This idea of managing an RPG character's life in between battles is a much more common thing now, but it was revolutionary back then. The series is still going strong, even spinning off into the fantasy genre with Metaphor ReFantasio, which, yes, Metaphor is a Persona game in everything but name. Way ahead of its time and still worth revisiting, especially with the recent Persona 3 Reload on modern consoles. Definitely check it out if you haven't already. The PlayStation 1 era was the age when video games started losing their religion. Just like the REM song, Stand. You have Final Fantasy Tactics making the church a major adversary on one hand, and on the other, you have Xenogears. Holy crap, I cannot believe I got away with playing this game as a teenager. If my dad had happened to walk in on a few scenes in particular, I would have been thoroughly excommunicated. Now, I'm kind of being a bit facetious about the PlayStation era ushering in this sort of change. In truth, JRPGs have been casting religion in a negative light for a long time, just not in America. We finally were deemed to be emotionally mature enough to handle these sorts of stories, and Xenogears is the one that exemplifies this for me the most. It tells the story of an amnesiac named Faye who has to pilot giant robots in order to kill God. Sort of. It's obviously much more complicated than that. Honestly, the reason Xenogears is on this list isn't just the fact that it turned a critical eye toward religion in a way we hadn't seen before, but just the depth of complexity of its story. Whereas most JRPGs felt extremely self-contained and honestly pretty small, the story of Xenogears made it feel as big as the universe. Even before you reach the end credits and see those famous words, Xenogears Episode 5, the end, you have a sense that there's so much more to the story than what they could fit in the game. In some ways that's literal, as anyone who's familiar with the famously incomplete Xenogears Disc 2 can attest. But beyond that, there's just so much backstory and history in this game. Not only that, but this was a story that took me as a player seriously. It dove into complicated philosophical and psychological concepts in ways that other games wouldn't try and tackle for years. And it wasn't just the story that broke ground. It had essentially 2 combat systems, one on foot and one in your giant mechs called Gears. I'm trying to think of another game that did something like this before Xenogears, and I'm coming up empty. If you can think of one, correct me in the comments. But this laid the groundwork for similar on-foot and in-mech dual combat systems to come, many from the Xeno series that Xenogears started. This game was an achievement, and it's one that the creators still seem to hold in high enough regard that they're continuing on in its name to this day. It provided me with vocabulary to be able to even think through my beliefs critically, and it opened my mind to the real possibilities within storytelling. It's in my top 3 favorite games of all time for a reason, and despite having some expected old school jank, it's very worth playing to this day. The established setting of most RPGs is, and often has been, high fantasy. Goblins and trolls and dwarves and magic, kings and queens and all that good stuff. To be perfectly honest, and no disrespect intended, but that is far and away my least favorite setting for a story. To me, it kind of feels like cheating. Like instead of creating a unique world for your story, you're starting with a template. You're coloring in a coloring book and not like painting the Mona Lisa. I think that's part of why I've always leaned more towards science fiction when it comes to the battle between the 2 great nerd genres. It feels like there's a lot more imagination that goes into creating those kinds of stories. Not that there aren't cookie-cutter sci-fi stories, but I see them less frequently. And that's part of why I instantly loved Phantasy Star IV for the Sega Genesis. The Phantasy Star series is more than just fantasy. That's why they spell it with a PH. It's pure science fiction set on an alien planet in the distant future, and even having missed the first 3 games in the series, I was fully invested in this game back in the day. Part of it was the combat and exploration. It had a fast-paced battle system that I enjoyed, even if I never fully got a grasp on all the weird spell and technique names. Foy? Zan? What? What in the heck do those mean? I remember joking around with my younger brother about those spell names back in the day. Man, that just unlocked some key memories for me, talking about that. Anyway, the gameplay was fun, but even back then, I was way more of a story kid, and the story in Phantasy Star IV is phenomenal. It's made even greater by the way it's told. Keep in mind, this was back in the 16-bit era when most games were telling their stories with character sprites that could barely emote and honestly hardly even moved. Phantasy Star IV had beautiful manga-style cutscenes that were honestly mind-blowing back then. This level of presentation was pretty much unheard of, especially for a game of Phantasy Star IV's scale. It created the sense that the adventure you were going on was even bigger than it was, just by nature of how its story was told. Other games would go on to use similar cutscene styles, heck, even as recently as Tales of Arise on modern platforms. But Phantasy Star pioneered the manga-style cutscene as an effective way to tell a story and give it weight, and it deserves a lot of credit for that. Now, I just wish we could get a new one. Not online, Sega. Not online. Chrono Trigger felt like a peek into the future right away. Not just because it was a story about time travel in which you actually did go into the future, but because it seemed like, after Chrono Trigger, how could JRPGs go back to the way they used to be? Well, it turns out not enough games learned Chrono Trigger's lessons right away, so the PlayStation era ended up having quite a lot of the same sorts of outdated gameplay mechanics that Chrono Trigger did away with. But eventually the industry caught up with its vision. The biggest piece of that vision, the one that feels the most obvious to me, is the complete and utter elimination of random battles. No longer did you have to worry about having your progress stopped at random intervals by a transition to a battle screen. Instead, battles took place with enemies you could see, right there on the map where you saw them. Now, I'm not saying Chrono Trigger was the first game to not have random battles, but it did by far the finest job of making each and every battle feel curated. By having battles take place on the screen where exploration took place, and by virtue of this being a 16-bit pixel game, that meant there wasn't unlimited space. Characters needed to be able to move around realistically to reach enemies, and enemies had to fit on the screen in ways that made sense. That means each battle had to be handcrafted by the developers. No just throwing a bunch of random numbers into a generator and having it spit out a fight. That alone was revolutionary in ways that would take ages to even see further attempts at. Even the game's own sequel, Chrono Cross, didn't bother trying to replicate it. Add to that a near perfect combination of characters, story, music, graphics, and the creation of the New Game Plus concept, basically, like every game has that now. And all that gives you the perfect swan song for the Super NES era. In many ways, I'm still chasing the high that I got from Chrono Trigger. And while a lot of games have come close to making me feel like I did playing it as a kid, I don't think any have quite gotten there. So in my book, that puts Chrono Trigger pretty far ahead of its time. Now, I know, Final Fantasy Tactics is not the forebearer of the Tactics JRPG. It owes its existence to Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre, but by taking all these various ingredients and combining them in just the right way, they gave us a game that has been the standard for tactical JRPGs ever since. Final Fantasy Tactics' incredibly intuitive gameplay design means that it's easy to grasp, despite being incredibly challenging to master. And when I say incredibly challenging, I mean young Brandon just fully gave up challenging. Now, you might push back by saying, hey, just because you gave up doesn't mean it's necessarily challenging. You're bad at video games. To which I would say, fair point. But that does sting a little bit. Think about how people might feel when you say the things you say, all right? Anyway, Final Fantasy Tactics brilliantly takes the refined job system from Final Fantasy V and works it seamlessly into the position-based tactical combat, and it's a match made in heaven, frankly. And sitting comfortably on top of the intricate battle system is one of the most epic, honestly Shakespearean stories ever told in a video game. Now, to be fair, in the original release, it read a little more like drunk Shakespeare, but even the sort of rough localization couldn't fully mask how epic that story was. And here's the best thing about me even bringing this game up. And that's that Final Fantasy Tactics: The Ivalice Chronicles is coming out soon, and that has a gorgeous localization, plus full voice acting with an incredibly talented cast. It is truly the best time to be a fan of this game. And because it was so far ahead of its time, they didn't even have to do much to modernize it. They've added a few quality of life features, like showing the turn order at all times on the side of the screen, but by and large, this is just a prettier, better sounding version of the masterpiece that came out 2 decades ago. Coming hot off the heels of Lunar and Lunar 2 finding new homes on the PlayStation, I was super excited for Grandia. This developer had already proven they could tell incredibly charming and heartfelt stories with those 2 earlier games, and Grandia was one of those Saturn JRPGs I was constantly crossing my fingers we'd get on the PlayStation. And I was not disappointed. The story of Grandia is cut from the same cloth as Lunar for sure. It's fun, it's lighthearted, it can even be silly sometimes. I mean, not working design silly, they didn't touch this one, but still. It has that game arts appeal, which 90s JRPG fans will know very well. But the thing that makes Grandia so ahead of its time is its freaking battle system. Now, we had seen turn-based battles before, and we had seen active time turn-based battles as well. But Grandia introduced a new element that added an enormous amount of strategy, and it's something that games have been replicating up until this day. Characters in Grandia battles move along the initiative point gauge. And by characters, I mean both your team and the enemies. When a character arrives at the command portion of the gauge, they're able to enter a battle command. After that, they enter the wait portion of the bar. How much time they spend in the wait portion is determined by what kind of action they're taking. A simple attack? You'll be in and out of there in no time. Casting a big old spell? It's going to take a bit longer. The key to Grandia's battle system is taking advantage of that wait time. While an enemy is waiting for its action to be carried out, they're vulnerable to being cancelled. If you can hit them just right while in that section of the IP gauge, they'll get sent back on the bar and essentially lose their turn. Of course, naturally, they can do the same thing to you, so there ends up being a huge amount of strategy involved. Other games have since adopted and modified this system, and it's such a solid one for combining turn-based combat with a more active yet strategic system. I wish there had been more Grandia. The 4 games we got were not enough, but at least we have decently easy access to them with the remastered collection of 1 and 2. We'll have to keep our fingers crossed that someone out there loves the IP enough to bring it back for real. It's funny, The World Ends With You was definitely ahead of its time, or maybe it's more accurate to say that it's uniquely its own thing regardless of time. But it owes a lot of its existence to another game later on this list that was also ahead of its time. But we'll get there. For now, it's enough to say that The World Ends With You is one of the most unique JRPG experiences out there. Period. It takes place in modern-day Tokyo, Shibuya in particular, and having recently experienced Shibuya in person, I can say it's pretty trippy walking around that place in real life after spending so much time in it here. You play as Neku, a loner kid who finds himself trapped in Shibuya and forced to play the Reaper's game, where he and a partner have to complete a bunch of arbitrary-seeming tasks before time runs out, or face deletion. It's a death game RPG that predates the wild popularity of death game as a genre. I mean, no, it's not the first, but it definitely got in before the huge wave that's overtaken us in recent years. So in that respect, it's ahead of its time. But the timelessness or uniqueness I mentioned has more to do with its combat. See, The World Ends With You was originally a Nintendo DS game, and combat took place on both the top and bottom screens at the same time. What this amounted to was forcing you to control action on the top screen and the bottom screen together. You use the stylus to input move combinations for Neku, and you use the gamepad to enter moves for Neku's partner. It was brain-breaking in concept, but in execution it somehow just worked. Like, I being famously bad at video games should not have been able to do it, but I did. It truly broke the mold for JRPG combat design. Now, it's been ported to various devices, including the Nintendo Switch most recently, and unfortunately, the lack of a dual screen on these things means that the battle system has been cut down to a pale shadow of its former self. But maybe someday we'll see another game that does something as crazy and ambitious as The World Ends With You. We can always hope. Yoko Taro is a mad genius. I feel like I say that every time he comes up, but I just feel like, in case you're unfamiliar, it's important that I lay that fact down right away. Yoko Taro does not make games like everyone else makes games. Yoko Taro makes games to dissect the genre of RPG, to find the things within it that make us happy or sad or uncomfortable, and bring them into the light, sometimes to excessive degrees. The first game in which that developmental philosophy was truly noticeable to me was the original Nier on the PlayStation 3. Now, I played Nier Gestalt because that's the one we got in North America, but there's since been a remake of Nier called Nier Replicant, and then a whole big string of numbers because Yoko Taro is crazy, so you can play that really easily now. The only real difference is in how the main character is presented. In Replicant, he's a young guy. In Gestalt, he's a middle-aged dude. I resonate more with the old guy, both because it's the version I played first, and because I am also an old guy. Old guys unite. Anyway, Nier straight up broke the genre over its knee and then lovingly put it back together. Honestly, it might be more accurate to say it broke the medium over its knee because it chooses to do some downright insane things for a video game. Not just in terms of the story, which is excellent and heavy and also extremely funny, but in terms of the gameplay. This is an action RPG at its core, but it doesn't always play like one. Sometimes it's a bullet hell shooter. Sometimes it's a top-down PC-style RPG, and sometimes it's a text-based adventure game. They ripped up the playbook and set out to make a game that defied every expectation of a genre fan, and they pulled it off. Its sequel, Nier Automata, would do most of these things again, only better, and it makes sense that it's the better-known game. But Nier will always have a special place in my heart for being so willing to break every convention in video games despite having no precedent for doing so. It is a masterpiece. Straight masterpiece. Earthbound is one of the weirdest games on the planet, and I just got done talking about Nier, so think about that for a minute. For one thing, the story is completely out there. For another, and probably more important thing, its setting is one that is almost never done. Earthbound takes place in the modern world, meaning a world with cars and burger joints and ATMs. It's the only setting that comes up in RPGs less than science fiction. But it's not your sort of boring everyday world. It's one that's been overrun with weirdness. The premise is that some giant alien from another time is slowly invading Earth and turning otherwise normal people and animals into crazy machines of destruction. And the only people who can stop it are 3 psychic kids and 1 nerd who's good with machines. Earthbound really leans into the absurdity. In other games, you might fight imps or dragons, but in Earthbound, you fight spiteful crows and new age retro hippies. In other games, you might have to rescue a princess from an evil warlord, but in Earthbound, you have to save your girlfriend from a cult that worships the color blue. But despite the goofy atmosphere, Earthbound actually tells one of the most psychologically rich stories in JRPGs. It was written by Shigesato Itoi, a Japanese writer who does not really do video games. I mean, he did Earthbound and its prequel and sequel, but that's it. He's not a developer, he's just a writer. A very strange writer. And he really laid the groundwork for not only other modern-day set JRPGs like The World Ends With You, but for deeper and more introspective storytelling in games in general. It's an odd little work of art that everyone should experience at least once. Dragon Quest V was the first Dragon Quest the West didn't get, at least not until the Nintendo DS remake years later. But it was breaking some crazy ground on the Super Famicom way back in the 90s. In Dragon Quest V, you play as the hero, but interestingly enough, unlike in other Dragon Quest games, you don't play as the legendary hero. You are not the destined hero who will defeat evil. You're just a monster tamer. You begin the game as a child, and eventually, as events unfold, you become an adult. Where Dragon Quest V really staked its claim is in the lineage system. Other games have since gone on to use a similar idea, like Fire Emblem Awakening, for example, but back in its day, Dragon Quest V was breaking new ground. In the game, you can actually choose someone to marry, and after that, you have children together. It's actually one of your children who's destined to be the legendary hero, but the story plays out a bit differently depending on who you choose to marry. Other games have had relationships at the core of the story, of course. Alufia 2 comes immediately to mind. But none have made the central relationship an active choice that you, the player, has to make. This sort of storytelling has become much more popular in the intervening years, but it really got its start way back in Dragon Quest V. It's one of the most beloved Dragon Quest games for a lot of reasons, but its completely unique method of storytelling for its time is definitely one of the main ones. Here's hoping it gets the remake treatment before too long. And those are my 10. What do you think? Did I miss any? I'm sure I did. Once again, let me know down in the comments, and who knows, maybe they'll end up in a future video. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this, would you consider liking and subscribing? It helps me out so much. Oh, and if you want to and are able to support me in the channel even more, I do have memberships available, so click down there if you want to know more about that. Thanks as always to my members, by the way. You guys are the best. And please go check out my podcast, the JRPG Pursuit. We put out new episodes every Wednesday. Link is in the description. So, with that, until next time. Bye.